Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I am Marc LiVecche. I am the McDonald Research Scholar at the Magdalen Center for Theology, Ethics, and Public Life at Christ Church, University of Oxford. And I am the editor-at-large for Providence Magazine, a journal of Christianity and American foreign policy. And I am here with my friend and soon-to-be minted Dr. Joseph Chapa. And I will let Joe introduce himself a little bit more thoroughly. Joe, welcome. Thanks for doing this.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks for having me. And I mean, I'm not very superstitious, but I haven't actually defended the dissertation yet. So I hope I'm assumed to be doctor. But
that's right. Knock on wood or something, right?
Right. Yeah, my name is Joe Chapa. I'm a U.S. Air Force officer, and I'm just finishing up a DPhil or PhD program at Oxford in the philosophy faculty. I'm looking at just war theory. So the program I'm on is really something like a fellowship funded by the U.S. Air Force Academy. So this is taxpayer dollars invested in me so that I'll be prepared to go back to the Air Force Academy and teach in the long term. So I'm really excited about that, really excited to finish up and kind of put this step behind and move on to serve the Air Force with the degree.
Fantastic. And congratulations on at least being done with the writing phase.
Yes, thank you. That was quite a milestone. It felt really good to hit enter on that submission.
Well, I'm sure. Mark Twain used to say that writing a book is the closest men come to childbirth. I think a dissertation is the same thing. So,
well, I got a little punchy in the footnotes by the end, and I realized that two thinkers I refer to frequently, Michael Walzer and Jeff McMahon, in various essays, they both describe the act of going to war as a process. It's not a single act, it's a process. Kind of like me, how I'm writing this essay right now, this is a process. And in the footnote, I thought, I'm not sure I agree with the analogy that writing an essay is like going to war, but having written this dissertation, I can commiserate with the idea.
Fantastic. Yeah, so congratulations, huge milestone. Can't wait for you to defend. I hope it's in person and not virtual. But in any case, I look forward to it being done. Why did you do all this? What's your thesis on? Why is it worth doing? What contributions do you hope to be making to what conversations?
Yeah, thanks for asking. So in recent just war literature, so over the past 20 or 30 years, there's been a pretty aggressive move to try to build an approach to just war theory that's grounded in individual rights. And so if you look at the long history of just war theory, there was a period of time before kind of the Enlightenment period that there just is no language of rights in normative theory. And so a lot of just war theory, almost 2,000 years of it, takes place without this language of rights. But then when the Enlightenment kind of bursts on the scene and we start talking about rights and what rights are inalienable and which ones aren't, and how valuable is a right to life, that sort of motivates this move to try to discuss the ethics of war in the framework of individual rights. And so this move over the last 30 years says, well, what would happen if just war theory is grounded in really the same approach to individual rights that we experience in everyday life? So right now, if I were unjustly attacked by some villain, that villain would give up his right not to be harmed, and I'm now justified in harming that villain to defend myself. And that's how we talk about self-defense and indeed other defense in a regular, everyday domestic context. And so in the last 30 years, this what's often called revisionist just war theory has attempted to say, well, maybe instead of thinking that war is this sort of special case where there are these moral principles that apply in war, but they don't apply in everyday life, maybe war is a continuation of ordinary morality. And if so, then there's a lot of work to do to be able to explain why, for example, the United States as a pretty large political community has a right to go to war with Japan, which is a pretty large political community in 1941. Now there's a lot of work to do to explain how we get from individual cases of self and other defense to kind of war, which is by definition on a large scale.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So is that in your mind an entirely salutary move? Are there problems with that?
So yeah, I think I agree with the people who have been developing this approach. I think that individual rights are important, and I think the reigning sort of account of just war theory in a lot of people's minds since 1977 has been Michael Walzer's view, which is pretty closely related to what's codified in international humanitarian law. And Walzer refers to that as the legalist paradigm. And so there's this legalist paradigm that looks a lot like international law. And I think one of the things that's missing there is an account of rights violations and infringements that take place in war. So here's one example. In Jonathan Shea's book, Achilles in Vietnam, he opens with this story of a patrol. There's a soldier who's brand new in Vietnam. He just arrived in country. This is his first combat experience. And his patrol that he's a part of is tasked with meeting these enemy soldiers who are going to be unloading boats on the beach in the early morning. So the patrol moves into position. It's 4 a.m. They wait till sunup, and right at sunrise, they just mow down the enemy soldiers. And the person he was interviewing says the firepower was unreal. And then they go check the bodies for intelligence, and they realized they had made a mistake. These were just fishermen, men and boys alike, just local fishermen. And so, so we can all agree that that's a tragedy, right? But if we ask, did the patrol do anything wrong? We're kind of going to get an ambiguous set of answers, right? Well, they sort of did something wrong in that they caused harm to people that they shouldn't have caused harm to. But based on the evidence they had, it seems like they did everything right. So they're not culpable. We wouldn't think that they're blameworthy in any way. And what I think the language of rights is able to do is distill those two questions and say whether the patrol is blameworthy or culpable, or whether we should sort of hold them accountable is one set of questions. And then whether the rights of the fishermen were violated is another set of questions. And I think if you build a just war theory account that doesn't pay close enough attention to individual rights, then you sort of miss the moral cost that's associated with that set of rights violations. So that's where I think this new kind of just war theory, I call it reductivist just war theory, because it thinks that the morality of war is reducible to individual morality. So this reductivist account of just war theory is really helpful in explaining these kinds of problems in military ethics. I do think, though, that there are some downsides. One of the common criticisms of reductivist just war theory is that it's a very theoretically complete and thorough, but it relies on so many cases that are sort of hypothetical and trolley problem style cases that it's hard to see how it might map on to war in the real world. That's one set of criticisms. So one of the things I'm trying to do in the dissertation is take all this theory, but then also apply it to real world cases in military history, or at least hypothetical cases that are set in a real world context, so that we can make sure that the theory marries up well with practice.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. It'd be interesting maybe to drill down on that. I was talking with Michael Walzer once, and he tends to strongly criticize the trolley type problems as being so abstract that they have no real world merit. And if they do have a real world sort of analogy to them, well, then why don't you just go to the real world analogy and just use that? At the same time, there could be an argument to be said. I'm, as you know, writing a book right now on, trying to promote a moral defense of the bombing of Hiroshima. And one of the problems straight away, I'm interested in the historic question, but I'm also interested in some of the moral questions that would help evaluate any similar sort of historic instance. So one of the problems I'm immediately faced with is I have to proclaim a certain understanding of the history and just beg that, and then I can do my moral analysis. And I know for a fact that half of my conversations, or 90% of my conversations, are going to be debating issues over the history. And so one of the nice things about the abstract, maybe, some people will argue, is you don't get into these side debates about the historic interpretation. So I like your project in that you're able to, I think, do both, which seems incredibly helpful. But
that's the goal, and I mean, it might be debatable how successful that is, because there is a lot of sort of ping-ponging back and forth between the obscure hypothetical case and then the real world case, which at the end of the day I think is maybe the best we can do. Because you're right, if you stick with solely real world cases, there's all this kind of emotional and intuitional baggage that comes along with those cases, right? So if you say, well, consider the Navy SEAL raid on Osama bin Laden. Well, all right, but people have strong feelings about that, right? So isolating a specific moral principle that's at play in a given case is really hard to do when there's several principles in play. And that's why the hypothetical cases are helpful, because you can strip down all those other principles and say, aha, I can now be confident that in this hypothetical case, what's acting on my intuition is this specific moral principle. And then you can build from there. So I appreciate that as a methodology for doing normative theory. I think that's really helpful. But again, you kind of have to keep bouncing it off the real world to see if it works.
Now, but before we get too far ahead, and I'm going to just push ahead without being diligent here, you've referred a couple of times to Michael Walzer and his understanding of just war tradition. Now we've got this reductionist just war tradition. One could be forgiven for thinking You're not talking about the just war tradition. You seem to be hinting that there's just war traditions. What's going on with that?
Yeah, so I took a just war theory class with Father Ken Himes at Boston College, and it was a great class. And he ended up being my thesis supervisor, and he's great. And first day, what he really wanted to drive home in that class was there is no such thing as just war theory. There is just war tradition, and I think it's absolutely true that there is a just war tradition. But it's equally true that in recent years, and I include Walzer in this, there has been an attempt to derive a just war theory or sets of competing theories of the just war. And the reductivists are pretty open about this, that this is what they're after, is a theory that accounts for the just war. It might be a flawed theory, but it is a comprehensive theory. And so one of the things I didn't realize until I got here, actually, sort of interacting with various people in conferences and things like that, that I really think there are three different approaches to just war theory, or we could at least build a taxonomy where we can recognize three different approaches. So one is closer to the ancient medieval approach. So that's heavily influenced by Christian ethics. And so you have contributors such as Augustine and Aquinas, and then the sort of the early moderns, right, that started to turn the just war tradition into international law. So think of people like Grotius and Vittoria. And then that really runs right through to the 20th century. And then what Walzer's trying to do, I think he would agree with this, is create a secular account of just war thinking. So although he's relying on traditional sources, he's not appealing to sacred texts authoritatively in the same way that Augustine and Aquinas did.
Right.
And so in practice today, and readers of Providence will know this, there are people who try to account for military ethics by appealing in part to sacred texts, right? And then there are people who try to account for military ethics without appealing to sacred texts. And so those are two broad categories that might both take collectives for granted, right? So I mentioned that there's the Walzerian view takes for granted the idea that states have rights of national defense, for example. So both of those two groups I just talked about will agree with that starting place, that political communities have rights as collectives. Then the third thing is the way that I approach just war theory, which is to say, no, it's the individual rights that are most important. States and political communities still have important rights, but they're derived from or reflective of those individual rights. And so I see those three kind of categories as the three broad approaches to just war theory. So what I'm doing in the dissertation is starting with the individualist, reductivist first principles, right? Those are the assumptions I begin with. And then I try to build a coherent account of a number of questions within just war theory.
Fantastic. So why don't we go ahead and jump into that? What's your basic thesis, and then how do you defend that thesis? Tell us about your dissertation.
Yeah, so this is hard to answer, in part because the Oxford philosophy faculty recently started allowing theses by independent papers, which is what I elected to do. So rather than one monograph thesis, I have 4 substantive papers that each drive at a different point. But in general, what I'm trying to do is say, look, I take the reductivist individualist position to be the best one. It might not, satisfy every problem that I have, but I take it to be the best starting place. And then in each of the 4 papers, I try to address what I see as a shortcoming in the way that just war theory has developed in that vein over the last 25 years or so. So broadly speaking, what I do in the first chapter is really set up a problem both for the Walzerian kind of collectivist view, and then I set up a problem for the reductivist view, and I try to show that the reductivist view has the best answer. But in so doing, I create what I think is a novel and strong account of why collectives have rights and duties in a military environment. So I can talk more about that in a second if you want. So that's sort of just to defend the reductivist way of doing just war theory in the first chapter. It's really the second chapter after the introduction. So then in the next substantive chapter, I try to recast individualist, reductivist just war theory, beginning not from conceptions of self-defense. So when I first brought all this up, I said, what if I was attacked by some villain? But actually, combatants in war aren't often in the self-defense business, right? We don't send soldiers off to war to defend themselves. If immediately after 9/11, if American soldiers wanted to defend themselves, they should have stayed home. That would have been the safest thing for them to do. But instead, they go off to war, and they do that to defend their fellow citizens, their countrymen, members of the political community. And so I try to, on the assumption, and I make an argument for it briefly, but I think most people agree, I might be permitted to cause self-defensive harm, but I don't think we would say I have a moral obligation to defend myself. I could choose to become a martyr and not defend myself,
Right.
and I wouldn't be violating any moral principles. But if you, Mark, were attacked right now, and if we weren't so aggressively social distancing, then I would have a moral obligation to come to your defense. And so I'm trying to recast this individualist just war theory on grounds of obligations of other defense rather than individual self-defense. And then in the next paper, I try to say that most of the literature that I'm working from looks at threats of imminent harm and threats of non-imminent harm. And I introduce a third category of continuing harm, because when a political community unjustly invades its neighbor, it's actually causing harm all of the time. It's not, in addition to discrete harmful acts of, shooting at soldiers, there's this threat of denying you your political autonomy. And so I just asked the question, what are the effects of that continuing threat of harm on military ethics? And then in the last chapter, I argue that that this reductivist account, this individualist account, has paid too much attention to rights violations and has largely ignored the objective moral badness of death. And so one of the things that happens on this reductivist individualist account is that it's really easy to put everything in its proper place, and you assign the liability relationships, and you say, well, the German soldiers in World War II, they were just fighting an unjust war, and they were liable to be killed. And so Allied soldiers killed them, and it looks like there's no moral cost there. And I argue that no, actually, the objective badness of death really still obtains in those cases. And if we forget that, then we miss a really big part of the moral costs of war.
No, fantastic. And yeah, and I definitely want to get back to that. That's a lot of the type of work that I've done in my own dissertation, as you know. Maybe bounce back to, you allude to a number of potential problems within revisionist just war theory that you attempt to fix. What do you think is your which one are you sort of the most confident of and the most proud of? What's the problem you were trying to fix? Why is it a problem? Why is it an issue? And what's been your solution?
Yeah, so the other defense paper, the paper that tries to recast individualist reductivist just war theory in terms of other defense, I think is crucial, partly because it's one of, as a military practitioner, as well as someone who studies just war theory, one of the things I find in conversations with fellow military people is that there's a strong aversion to reductivist individualist just war theory, partially grounded in the sense that the reductivist individualist doesn't really pay any attention to the fact that this soldier was ordered to go to war. So let's just imagine, I know people disagree about this, but let's imagine for the sake of argument that the US 2003 invasion of Iraq was objectively unjustified. Knowing what we know now, we look back and we say we shouldn't have done that. Okay, well, on the revisionist or the reductivist individualist view, US soldiers who participated in that war, I am one of them, they did not have a moral justification for doing that. And so when they caused harm to Iraqi soldiers, for example, that was unjust harm. They violated Iraqi soldiers' rights. And that means that Iraqi soldiers were justified in shooting back, in defending themselves. And so now on that view, the American soldiers are morally liable to be killed, and the Iraqi soldiers are not morally liable to be killed. And when military practitioners hear that, they say, now, wait a second. You don't seem to have incorporated the fact that my president told me to go do that. We were ordered to go do that. Where does that fit into the equation? And so now I'm not offering a Nuremberg defense here to say that, oh, well, if you're acting under orders, then everything's permissible. But what I'm doing in the other defense paper is looking closely at the fact that when those soldiers in 2003 went to Iraq to fight that war, many of them, some of them at least, did so believing in their heart of hearts that they were defending mom and dad back home against Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction. And if they were epistemically justified in believing that they were acting in other defense, then on my argument, they don't become liable to defensive harm. And so that separates me from a lot of the reductivist individualist just war theorists. So I'm trying to carve out a space there where there's this moral tragedy of a person who justifiably believes that they have an obligation to go to war, even though they're mistaken about that, all things considered. And so I want to carve out a space to say that person remains morally immune to defensive harm. They retain their right not to be killed. And then what you end up with is Iraqi soldiers who retain their right not to be killed, and American soldiers who retain their right not to be killed. And when they clash on the battlefield, it's morally tragic because it genuinely is a misunderstanding. And if both of them were able to be omniscient about all the facts of the case, they would be able to come to a resolution that doesn't involve killing anyone. And so again, that's a place where I'm trying to kind of put moral tragedy back into the reductivist individualist account of just war theory.
Okay. What's the word I want? Not summary. Review. You've reductivist. The reductivist position contrasts with traditionally what position?
So it's sometimes called the traditionalist. I call it the exceptionalist position.
Right.
So the view that holds that war is morally exceptional, and all these moral principles kick in when a war starts.
Right. So that might be the I was just following orders defense, and in the perverse extreme.
Right. So that's the perverse extreme. Within the sort of reasonable person realm, it's the international law view. So when soldiers go to war, even if it's an unjust war, as long as they follow the dictates of jus in bello, we say they haven't done anything wrong. They were actually morally justified in causing those harms. And on the reductivist view, because we're looking at individual rights, you have to say, wait a second, how did those Iraqi soldiers lose their right not to be killed? What did they do to cause themselves to lose a vital right like that? And so that's where the tension is between the exceptionalist and the reductivist.
Now you talk about the liability to be killed. What about permission to kill? Does that come in, and where does that map on to these different positions?
Yeah, so I follow others. I get the definition from Jeff McMahon, but he distinguishes between a permission, a mere permission, and a justification. So you're permitted to do something as long as you're not obligated not to do it. So lots of things might be permissible, but you're justified in doing something only if you have a positive moral reason for acting. And so if some attacker out there, some nemesis becomes liable to defensive harm, that by itself, their liability by itself might make it permissible for me to harm them, but I don't yet have a moral justification for harming them. So you have to add their liability to be killed with some moral reason for killing them. And typically in war, that moral reason is defined in terms of either self or other defense. So I am going a level above that and saying, in addition to permissions and justifications, we have moral obligations sometimes. And so I'm saying if you combine that attacker's liability to be harmed with the moral obligation to defend your fellow countrymen or fellow citizens, then that becomes a full obligation. So now I'm obligated to kill that person, and when I do, I haven't violated their rights.
Right. Okay. You've touched a couple of times on the problem that always obtains because human beings don't have omniscience. If we had omniscience, this might be a bad question because it's going to be potentially have a very simple answer. But if we had omniscience, how much of the problems you're trying to grapple with in the dissertation would be resolved?
Some of them certainly would. So in the case of the soldier who is justified in believing that he fights a just war, even though he doesn't, obviously if he were omniscient, that problem dissolves. But a number of the other problems still are still relevant. So in the first substantive paper, what I'm trying to do there is tell a story to explain why it's the case. So here's the case. In the 1990s, the UN Security Council passed 2 resolutions against the state of Iraq, and the US-led coalition enforced those resolutions. One of which was that Saddam Hussein couldn't conduct military operations to include flying airplanes north and south of certain parallels, and so those were Operations Northern and Southern Watch. And so there's an account in 1998. What was happening was Saddam's forces were taking pot shots at US fighters who were trying to enforce those resolutions. And so the rules of engagement up until 1998 said, if a surface-to-air missile site shoots at you, you are permitted to shoot back at that particular surface-to-air missile site. But the SAM operators got really good at launching weapons and then turning the radar off, or using a mobile system, shooting at the Americans and then running and hiding behind the trees. And so it was really difficult to shoot back at that one site that shot at you. So in 1998, President Clinton changed the rules of engagement and said, okay, from now on, if that mobile system shoots at you, you can shoot at any part of the integrated air defense system that you want. Well, because so many of those sites were fixed, we knew where a bunch of them were. So it was much, much easier to say, okay, if you shoot at me with a mobile site, I'm just going to attack your fixed site. Now, as an individualist, I have to explain why the dude sitting in the command trailer of the fixed site becomes liable to be killed. What has he done wrong, right? He hasn't harmed anyone. And so the account I offer there is one according to which, in the military, participating in an activity that complicates the enemy's operational problem, that is a contribution to the military threat. So think about, Patton's army leading up to D-Day, right? Everyone knew who Patton was. He was kind of the sensational tank commander. They all assumed that he was going to spearhead the attack. And so they gave him inflatable tanks and they broadcast signals and they made up fake patches and they made it look like he was the commander of the first US Army group. And we know now that was all a ruse, right? So my question I'm asking theoretically is, was Patton contributing to the D-Day operation, even though he doesn't have any tanks? And I think absolutely he was.
Right.
And so if that had been an unjust attack, Patton would have become liable to defensive harm as a result. So just to give you an unjust example, there's this great case of Quaker guns in the South during the American Civil War, right? So the Quaker guns is a joke, right? Because the Quakers are pacifists. And so they would cut trees down. So the Confederate Army would cut trees down, paint them black to look like artillery cannons, and lean them up against the walls of fortresses throughout to try to make it look like they had a lot more firepower than they had. And so again, as an individualist, I want to say, is the guy who's cutting down the trees and painting them black, is he liable to be killed? Absolutely he is, because he's complicating the operational problem facing the Union Army. So even though he's not holding a weapon, a real weapon, he becomes liable to be killed. So all that to say, I think that problem is a genuine problem, even if everyone's omniscient, because in the state of omniscience, you might still have unjust aggression, and unjust aggression might still involve things like deception. And so the end result of all of that is to say, even by signaling participation, which is wearing a uniform and manning a post, you are complicating the operational problem. And then if your fight is an unjust fight, then you become liable to defensive harm as a result.
So it seems that you've potentially set up a problem that if I understand correctly, you've expanded the kill list, right? More people can be killed under your account than under different accounts. But there's now a problem of this moral tragedy. So your account, it seems, expands the possibility of there being morally tragic and potentially terribly burdensome moral costs to warfighters. Is that accurate?
It is. So it's a little complicated in the conception of other defense. In one sense, that narrows who's liable to be killed.
Right.
It narrows it based on who believes what and who's justified in believing that.
Yeah.
But you're right. In the paper I just described, I'm expanding it pretty drastically. And the reason for doing that is that one of the criticisms against reductivist just war theory, individualist reductivist just war theory, is that it becomes contingent pacifism. So it's not pacifism in principle, but because so few people will be liable to be killed, you would never be justified in sort of rolling through with the military and targeting all the military people, because you just don't know whether that individual person, whether their actions have risen to the level of liability to be killed. So on my view, the place I think I'm helping here is by saying, even if you start from reductivist individualist first principles, you still can get to a place where by putting on a uniform and acting like a military person in combat, you become liable to defensive harm, assuming that your war is an unjust war. And that's the big thing that separates reductivist individualists from collectivist exceptionalists. But I'm still broadening the scope of who on the unjust side becomes liable to harm. And I think that bolsters the reductivist individualist position against this attack that it becomes contingent pacifism.
Yeah, that's right. Because in the sort of absurd extreme view, the contingent pacifism comes from even if there's a group of soldiers all with weapons, if one of them isn't firing at you, does that individual person pose harm? Right? In your view, yes. Right.
Yeah.
What I would take would be the classic just war view. Yes, this isn't an issue.
Right.
But one can see how, if you insist on someone posing harm to you, all of a sudden you end up with potentially absurd circumstances.
Right. And one thing that that does turn out to be important, I think, in the dissertation is that what a lot of reductivist individualist theorists will do is say, okay, if there's 10 soldiers and 9 of them are shooting at you,
Right.
that 10th soldier is still probably liable to harm, because if he's not shooting at you now, he's going to next week. And so most theorists in this kind of camp have rejected imminent harm, imminent threat, as a necessary condition for defensive harm. So as long as he's going to unjustly threaten me eventually, then he's probably liable to be killed now. But what I do in the continuing threats chapter is say, when an unjust invading army persistently violates your right to political autonomy, you're justified in causing more harm than you would otherwise be in defending yourself and your fellow citizens. But there are some cases of war where that continuing threat doesn't happen. So think about, U.S. targeted killings abroad. So you might think that this, ISIS leader or this Al-Qaeda leader, not to mention any specific names, you might think they're liable to be killed because they threaten to cause unjust harm to U.S. citizens or something, civilians. But what they don't do is invade the United States and violate rights of political autonomy. And so what's interesting to me is that the proportionality calculus, even the jus ad bellum proportionality calculus, might be different if you're defending against an invading force than if you're fighting against a non-state terror organization, for example, that's still conducting unjust, lethal attacks against your citizens. So you'll have some proportionality threshold, but it might not permit you to do quite as much as you would do against an invading force. And I think that's an important restraint on the use of force.
No, excellent. Let's move to the question of moral tragedy. You brought this up a couple of times. I think you've defined it, but just to be clear, what is morally tragic about war?
Yeah, so I want to distinguish between what moral costs, sort of simply, and moral tragedy, because I think it's easy to just label all the bad things that happen in war as moral tragedy, but I want to be specific about a few things. So I hold that I argue in the dissertation that any death in war is a moral cost that needs to be accounted for, and we should remember those. There's a line in J. Glenn Gray's memoir in which he says something like, we came across this hastily built cemetery that had about 75 Americans and 25 Germans buried there, and he said, until I saw that cemetery, I had not understood the devastation of war. And it's interesting to me that he recognizes the devastation of war when U.S. Service members and German service members, that's the enemy in World War II, are laying side by side, right? So he's overcome with the moral cost of death, independent of what side they were on, independent of whether they had a moral justification, independent of whether they justifiably believed that they had a moral obligation, et cetera, right? And so I'm concerned that the reductivist individualist view, with its strong emphasis on liability and rights relationship, fails to see the cost of that is manifest in this cemetery.
Right.
So in that paper,
go ahead.
So in that paper, I'm developing this account of moral cost that we just sometimes lose sight of in the style of just war theory that I do. And then the moral tragedy I'm interested in is I think the best definition I can come up with is like this: what the reductivist individualist position is trying to do is use an account of distributive justice to assign liability and rights relationships. So a person becomes liable to defensive harm because that's the morally best distribution of harm given the circumstances of the case, right? If two people are going to harm each other, who should have that harm distributed to them? Well, the person who was responsible for the unjust harm in the first place. That's why the person who attacks me becomes liable to defensive harm. But in the case I gave of the person who justifiably believes they act on a moral obligation, well, now they don't become liable to defensive harm. Neither does the person on the just side of the war. And now you have these two people facing off, both of whom retain their right not to be killed. To me, that's morally tragic in the sense that it's not the best distribution of harms and goods. The best distribution of harms and goods depends on a better epistemic position, right? If they were omniscient, then they could more efficiently, sort of more effectively, in a more morally satisfying way, they could distribute goods and harms. So that's what I'm driving at as moral tragedy. But I don't want to sort of make that sound like the moral costs of death are in any way less significant. They're just two different. It's a taxonomy that includes these two different kinds of moral cost, and I think both are really important.
As I'm not sure that this is asking you to put a different hat on as a military commander would have, but in a pastoral mode, uh, somebody comes to you. You know, maybe it's the guy in Jonathan Shea's uh, anecdote with which you opened, who opens fire on a bunch of fishermen. You know, maybe it's an airman who has a bad kill. Uh, what does your thesis and the work you've done there, how does that aid you pastorally in ministering to somebody who is now suffering on account of the moral tragedy or the moral costs that you're describing? What contribution do you think you make to soldier care, to warrior care?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think this conception, I'm sort of trying to bolster this view that all death is morally bad. And
Right.
in war, we set out to go take people's lives, and morally speaking, that's a big deal. And so I'm not a psychologist, right? So I'm not gonna wade too deeply into those waters. But I don't think it's unreasonable to suppose that if there's a moral cost that has to be borne, there might also be a psychological cost that has to be borne. And moral injury, I think, is the appropriate overlap between the two fields, between moral philosophy and moral psychology. And so so I do think it's a little unfair to that airman or soldier or whomever. It's a little unfair if the only response we can offer as a military institution is, well, you got the bad guys, and that's
Right.
what matters. And let's say it wasn't an operation that went badly, and let's say that the people that were harmed were all the people we intended to harm, and they were all liable to be killed, etc. Even then, the moral psychology suggests that there is sometimes a cost to be borne there. That can be a transgressive act that causes moral injury or that results in moral injury. And if the only response we have as an institution is, hey, we got the baddies, then that's really shallow. That's a really unhelpful response. And so I do think one of the things that my thesis can offer is this really strong sense in which, no, the moral badness of death is objective, and it doesn't change with respect to changes in liability. So even if they're the bad guys, and even if they're threatening to cause harm unjustly to innocent persons, and even if we have to kill them to defend against that harm, that the objective badness of their death is the same badness of death that it would be if they were on our side.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think once that kind of restores this sense of humanity to war, right? That their moral value as human persons is the same as my moral value as a human person. And that, I think, helps to empathize or sympathize with that airman to a degree, to say, yeah, it is not at all surprising that you feel this moral weight as a result of what you've done, because this is a morally weighty business. I mean, Karl Marlantes in What It Is Like to Go to War, he says that soldiers deal in eternity, right? Because they are confronted with these life and death questions. And I think it's not that we do this as an institution, but there are certainly conversations I've heard within the institution that sort of take this tone of, well, they're bad guys, and we got to get the bad guys. And I just think that's not quite enough. We need to say more than that.
Right. So
To that young airman.
you're making a place for grief, even if that grief might be absent moral guilt. The grief is appropriate.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think it is one of the things that we in the U.S. in an all-volunteer force, it's one of the things that we volunteer to do on behalf of our fellow citizens, is that I volunteer to bear that burden, that psychological burden, on behalf of my fellow citizens. And I think that's really significant. And I think that's a really sacrificial act. And to be honest, I don't think most 18-year-old airmen or 22-year-old lieutenants know that they're volunteering for that at the outset. And so it's part of the maturation process as we sort of raise young airmen up and across the services, right, to sort of instruct them that this is one of the things that you're going to be asked to do. Mm-hmm. And so when I hear the words "thank you for your service," to my mind, that's one of the things that's sort of involved in the content of what's being thanked there.
Right. So there's right. So your thesis is valuable for citizens who send their sons and daughters off to war as well. So when we thank you for your service, we have maybe some better knowledge of what that service entails.
Absolutely. And as soon as we recognize that we don't send soldiers off to defend themselves, right? We send soldiers off to defend the rest of us. As soon as we recognize that relationship, we have to, I think, societally, as citizens, not just as military people, we have sort of a normative moral obligation to to recognize what our role in this is, right? That there's some ownership that we take on as citizens for sending young people off to do terrible things to other people, even when those terrible things are morally justified and morally obligatory.
That's right. As I bring this to an end, I want to drill a little bit deeper into this. This idea of grief, of having a place for grief in combat. Can that grief be experienced or understood in the midst of combat? Or is there a kind of callousness, a thickening of one's skin that has to occur? And then sometime after action, there can be a process where one begins to recognize, to articulate, to proclaim, and to come to terms with their grief? Or can these things happen simultaneously in combat? How does all that work?
So I think everyone is different, right? I mean, I think humans are complex creatures, and so you might have two different people that experience it very differently. But I do think in general, it is important to kind of recognize a cyclical nature of this kind of experience. So I do think, SLA Marshall's study, I know a lot of people criticize it now, and Dave Grossman talks about it on Killing, but if it is the case that lots and lots of soldiers and lots of firefights chose to shoot in the air rather than to shoot at their opponents, right? If that's true, then I can imagine it to be the case that if what you're deeply focused on is the humanity of the other person, you might have a hard time squeezing the trigger. And so I do think there's a place for compartmentalization and callousness in situations in which you're morally obligated to do these violent things. But I don't think you can persist in the long term in that kind of compartmentalization. And so I think what I think we're starting to see in some of the psychology literature is that it's really important to have this reconstitution time where during which people can come to terms with what they've done and make restitution in whatever ways are meaningful for them. I mean, I spoke to a young airman who said, well, he's a staff sergeant actually, so not really a young airman, but he said I would really like some sort of tangible process that I could literally wash my hands with my teammates at the end of some period of time, and we can recognize that we have blood on our hands, and I mean, it's a metaphorical sense, but it's a very serious sense in which we have blood on our hands, and that we need to go through some kind of cleansing process to recognize and be reintegrated into society. So I think that's important, and I don't think we do that enough just in modern militaries in general.
No, that's right, and obviously there are long theological traditions for reintegrating soldiers home. Carl Molantis, in the book you recommend, What It Is Like to Go to War, he talks about the same thing at maybe a more secular dimension. So is that purely chaplain's work, or is there a place for a commander in the field to be able to do that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't think it's purely chaplain's work at all. And in fact, I spoke with the chaplain, a wing chaplain, not too long, I guess it was about a year ago, about a lot of these issues. And when I was asking about how he can care for airmen who have had these kind of experiences and are struggling, he said, "Look, I can do everything I can do, but I'm a non-combatant by law. I'm not an expert on that part of it. They have to be able to get, sort of that frontline care, first responder care from their fellow combatants in the squadron." And I thought that was a really interesting claim, right? Where I think most people's inclination is to look and say, we've got a chaplain, we've got a psychologist, this is their problem. But the chaplain and psychologist are saying, well, it's our problem, because that, especially for young people where this is maybe their first encounter with this kind of event, they need that sort of crusty old sergeant who's done it before to be able to walk them through the healing process.
That's fantastic. All right, Joe, thank you for your time. I'm going to let you get back to your quarantine. But what's next for you? What's the process for you in your dissertation?
So it's submitted. I'm waiting for the examiners to schedule the defense. So I anticipate that'll happen in the next month or so. And then from that moment forward, I've completed the requirements, unless they ask for changes, in which case I'll need to make those changes first. But I'm hoping for the best here. And then I will have completed the requirements. And then I just need to wait for the Secretary of Defense to lift the stop movement order so I can move back to the United States.
Fantastic. And it'll be a public defense in theory?
I don't think so, no.
Oh, okay.
In fact, so I think it will be via teleconference, and the guidelines are very strict that there will be no recording of any kind. Yeah, it'll all be very mysterious.
So I can't sit in the background and sling questions or anything.
No, thank goodness for that.
All right, very good. Well, congratulations on that. Keep me informed, and look forward to what's next.
All right, thanks very much. Thanks for having me.
No, for sure. Love to the family. Take care.
See you, Mark.